So if you're following along in the book, we're looking at the book of prayer. Of course, it's a chapter of prayer, and the subtitle heading is "Faslun fi Salat al-Musafir." Faslun fi Salat al-Musafir, which basically means it's a section on prayer of the traveler. Okay, so obviously the chapter is going to be discussing shortening prayer, this particular section here, even though it says Faslun fi Salat al-Musafir, the prayer of the traveler, we're going to be talking about shortening prayer specifically, and that is associated with travel a great deal. Shortening prayer is something which is permitted in Islam based on the consensus of the Ummah. And this can be attributed to the verses of the Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, specifically verse 101 in Surah An-Nisa. Allah says, وَإِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَن تَقْصُرُوا مِنَ الصَّلَاةِ إِنْ خِفْتُمْ. What means when you travel through the land, it is permissible for you to shorten the prayer, especially if you fear an attack by the disbelievers. And the verse here associated with shortening prayer is connected to fear, and that's because, the scholars say, the majority of the Prophet's travels were filled with fear. If you think about his life, when he was traveling, it was often to go out to battle. Or he was traveling and was worried that it's possible that they could have been overtaken. It's also been stated by Umar ibn Khattab. He was asked a question. Ya'la ibn Umama asked him, how are we to shorten our prayer while we are secure? Meaning we're not in a state of fear anymore. But now, during the time of Umar ibn Khattab, after the Prophet ﷺ, things settled, especially in the Muslim lands. So he's saying, how are we going to keep shortening our prayer? And so Umar ibn Khattab, he responded and said, it's a sadaqah from Allah. He has extended it to you, so accept that sadaqah. This is found in Sahih Muslim. Ibn Umar, the son of this great companion, also a companion himself, he says, I was a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, and he would not exceed 2 rak'ahs while traveling, meaning he would shorten the prayer. And Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman, they did the very same thing. This is muttafaqun alayh, agreed upon. All right, so that kind of establishes the foundational evidence of shortening prayer in Islam, in the Quran, in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, in the lives of the great companions as well. And so, obviously, the great Imam al-Buhuti, rahimahullah ta'ala, is going to begin talking about this. He says, Man safara safaran mubahan, يومين فأكثر فله قصر رباعية ركعتين. Whoever embarks upon من سافر سفرا مباحا, a permissible journey, meaning that they begin by making the intention to undergo a permissible journey. Permissible journey is important because this means it's going to exclude an impermissible or a disliked journey. An impermissible journey or a disliked journey. An impermissible journey would be like, I'm traveling for the sake of gambling. We're going to Las Vegas to gamble all this money. Okay? Or I'm traveling to go drink. Okay? That's an impermissible journey. A disliked journey would be, I'm going to wander about aimlessly. Just wander around with no objective, no aim, no destination. I'm going to be a wanderer. That would be considered disliked, and we'll just talk about that shortly in greater detail. So the permissible journey, whether it's obligatory or recommended or mubah. So an obligatory journey would be like the obligatory journey to make Hajj. or to fulfill an obligatory umrah, or for hijrah, to migrate if it was obligatory, or an obligatory jihad, to go into military service. Recommended travel would be like visiting relatives, traveling to visit the sick, to visit the masajid, like the Prophet's masjid, or Masjid al-Aqsa. These are recommended to visit, and so traveling to visit them is recommended in nature. Also, neutral travel, meaning it's not on this side or that side of the scale. And this would be like a business trip. You're going to go for some business, or you're going to sightsee a particular destination, or you're going on a permissible vacation, or a trip in which the intention is mostly permitted, right? So now you have a combination of things. Most of the intention is that it is permitted, like I'm going on a business trip, but when I get to my destination, I'm going to have a drink or two. So the majority of the intention is permissible. Business is halal. While there's a little bit of something impermissible in there, so long as the majority of that is permissible, then it will be permitted to shorten the prayer. If the intention is 50-50, no, you're not permitted. If the majority of your intention is to go and do something impermissible or something disliked, it is not permitted to shorten the prayers. Okay, so this is, of course, a permissible journey of 2 days or more. 2 days or more, we're not going to talk about, so this is like kind of how it's discussed in terms of time frame for the Prophet ﷺ. But today we discuss the journey based on distance, because we could do a lot more in 2 days than you can back then. We can do a lot more in 1 hour than you could back then. Okay? And this is a trip by land or by sea, and it's basically the equivalent of a one-way journey. So you're not going to count going there and back, but you're going to count the distance of your origin to your final destination, the distance going that way. Okay, and so how they look at it of at least 2 days of travel, this is on foot with luggage during an average day, meaning like the season where the days aren't too short and they're not too long, and the person is walking an average speed. So if you meet these basic requirements, then you can shorten the prayer, which is better than completing and praying the prayer full. Okay, shortening. Now, what I want you to do in your mind right now is detach shortening and combining prayer. You know, combining prayers, praying 2 prayers together. So we're going to talk about that later. So these things, while they're associated with each other, they are not one and the same. So you can shorten a prayer, and you don't have to combine the next prayer. So here, shortening is better than completing, and this is based on the explicit statement of Imam Ahmad, and that is due to the fact that the Prophet ﷺ and his companions regularly shortened their prayer. And you shorten a 4 rak'ah prayer, like Dhuhr, Asr, or Isha. You shorten them to a 2 rak'ah prayer. The distance, you got to do your math here. The distance, because there's always some questions about, well, what's the distance which permits shortening prayer? So Imam al-Bahuti does not mention the details in this book, Umdatul Talib, but if you look at the more expansive works, you'll find that the Imams, they break down the distances very, very minutely, if you will. So they say the distance is 4 barids. Okay, that's like the Arabic English version of that. The barid this is like the distance, a measure of distance some time ago. What we're looking at is the numbers here. 4 barids. 1 barid is equal to 4 farsakhs. 1 farsakh is equal to 3 Hashimi miles. 1 Hashimi mile is equal to 12,000 feet, or 6,000 dhira'a, dhira' al-yad, which is the measurement of your forearm and your hand. 6,000 of these. 1 dhira' equals 24 average fingers side by side. Okay? 1 finger is equal to 6 barley grains lined up side by side. 1 barley grain is equal to 6 non-Arabian horse hairs side by side. That's how they would measure the distance of travel. Imam Ahmad was asked about the distance which permits shortening prayer. He said 4 barids. Remember that breakdown. In response, they said, you mean a full day's travel, 1 day? He said, no. 4 barids is 16 farsakh, 2 days of travel. Now, to put that into modern day equivalents, some have attempted to do this. And the smallest unit that I'm aware of that they have made an equivalent for is 1 finger. The width of a finger being 2 centimeters. So 2 centimeters, now this is where we go back up the scale. 2 centimeters, you multiply that by 24. Remember, 24 average fingers side by side to get 1 dira'a. You get 2 times 24 is 48. That's 1 dira'a. And then you have 48 centimeters times 6,000 dira'as. That equals 2.88 kilometers, which is equivalent to 1 Hashemite mile. Then you take that times 3, 2.88 times 3, which equals 8.64 kilometers, which makes 1 farsakh. And you take 8.64 kilometers, 1 farsakh, times 4, and you get 34.56 kilometers. And then you take 34.64 kilometers times 4, and you get 138.24 kilometers. So 138 kilometers based on this particular breakdown of the equivalent in today's modern standard, measurement standards. 138 kilometers is like 85 miles. That's not the only view. This is like the longer view. Ibn Abbas measured it equivalent to travel. Ibn Abbas, a great companion of the Prophet ﷺ, measured it equivalent to travel. He said the travel from Usfan to Mecca, the time it takes to get from Ta'if to Mecca and from Mecca to Jeddah. Now, if you look at Google Maps, okay, and you map Usfan to Mecca, or Jeddah to Mecca, or Ta'if to Mecca, you'll find that each of those trips takes roughly 85 kilometers, which is about 52 miles. And this is based on a narration that he reported from the Prophet ﷺ, in which he said, O people of Mecca, do not shorten in less than 4 barids from Mecca to Usfan. This hadith is narrated by Imam al-Darqutni. So here you can see either, 138 kilometers. Others, they said 85 kilometers. That's like, 85 miles or 52 miles. Basically, you've got a discrepancy of 53 kilometers or a discrepancy of 33 miles. So that's why you might find some they say this and some they say that. And each of them have their method of dealing with these distances and the modern day equivalences thereof. However, what seems to be prevalent in many of the fatwa is the 85 kilometers or the 52 miles. I have teachers that have taught me both this one, and another teacher would say that one. And they would argue their position and defend their stance. So, you have an idea what the distance looks like. The trip must have a specified destination that meets the distance requirement in order for you to shorten. Meaning, let's just say, for example, 52 miles. We take the shorter one. In order for me to shorten my prayer, my journey has to be at least 52 miles. And this is taqriban, la tahdidan. It's not something that's exact, but it's like a roundabout. So if you're around 50 miles or so, then that's your journey's destination. You're permitted to shorten your prayers. A person who leaves aimlessly, or a person that doesn't know the way, is not permitted to shorten. Nor is someone who intends to wander, and I mentioned this before. Like, you're going to travel, but there's no destination, you're just wandering about. I'm just going to keep traveling around and just traveling without any real destination. Wandering without a destination is considered disliked. Imam Ahmad said wandering is not from Islam at all. It's not the way of the prophets and messengers. When they traveled, they were going from one place to the next. They had a destination. There was an aim, there was an objective that they were going to fulfill, and their travel was a means to do so. So, if the trip is roughly that distance, even if the travel is less than an hour, remember we said initially it was 2 days traveling. What we're talking about now is a distance now, not a time. So if you were to cover that distance, even less than an hour, you're permitted to shorten the prayer. You hopped on a plane, you flew 100 miles, it only took you an hour, you can now shorten your prayer. When do you begin shortening the prayer? Might be the question. Say, look, I got a trip. I'm going to be going around 1 o'clock. Or let's say I'm going to go around 2 o'clock. When do I begin to shorten the prayers? Imam Bahuti says, إِذَا فَارَقَ عَامِرَ بُيُوتِ قَرْيَتِهِ وَهُوَ أَفْضَلُ مِنْ إِتْمَامٍ. So as he says, so long as they have surpassed the constructed homes of their town. That's when you can begin shortening your prayer. So long as you are still in your town, even though you know you have a journey coming up, you have travel coming up, you're still here. It's 1:15, it's time for Dhuhr, you're not going to leave until 2 o'clock. You say, hey, look, I'm going to shorten the prayer, and then I'll get on the road. Because you're still there, you're not allowed to shorten the prayer yet. إِذَا فَارَقَ عَامِرَ بُيُوتِ قَرْيَتِهِ. He says you have to surpass the constructed homes of your town, meaning the residential area where there's homes, tents, yurts, schoolies, whatever it is, whatever dwellings people are occupying, you have to get outside of that area. And you don't have the intention to return. You're going to go out and then come right back. Or you don't go out and then come back right back within a short period of time. Right? You go out and then something brings you back. Oh, I forgot the gift I was going to take with me. I got to go back in. So now that you're back in, you don't get to shorten. Now you're back in. You got to wait until you get back out again for you to be able to shorten the prayer. If you do not intend to return or your intention changes due to some issues that arise, so if you do not intend to return or the intention changes, okay, and then you end up coming back, you can't shorten until you return and then leave again. And you have to meet the above mentioned conditions. If you go out and you shorten your prayer and then you end up coming back, you're not obliged to perform the prayers again, meaning your prayer's done, you shortened it. Even if you didn't reach that minimum threshold of travel, it's over, it's finished, you completed your obligation because your intention was to go out. While you were out, you made your prayer, and then something happened and brought you back in. So all is well. If you're in a scenario where two towns run together, right, where the residential areas of two towns have grown to the point they've become one. It appears they've become one, and all there is the line on the map. Like you've got Cherry Hill and Marlton, or Maple Shade, or whatever, where they, like, you don't know. Your neighbor is in one township and you're in the other township, right? So here, the way that you are going to look at this is as if it is one residential area, even if they are considered two towns. So you would have to wait until you get out past even the homes of the neighboring town that is joined with yours. So that is when you will be able to begin. Also, we talked about what prayers would be what prayers would be shortened. So Fajr, of course, is not going to be shortened. We wouldn't pray one. If you shorten Fajr, that means you would only pray 1 rak'ah. And there's no likeness to this in the obligatory prayers. Okay? So for that reason, you're not going to shorten Fajr prayer. Maghrib prayer is also not shortened. You pray 3. Because Maghrib prayer, if you take off 1 rak'ah, then you're praying 2. And Maghrib is considered witrun nahar. It's the witr of the day. So if you remove the 1 and you have 2, you're no longer praying witrun nahar. If you remove 2 rak'ahs to shorten Maghrib prayer, then you would be like Fajr. You'd only have 1. And there's no likeness to that, and so it's not something that is to be done. Another thing that you have to keep in mind when it comes to this concession is that If you intend to travel just to shorten the prayer, what do you think the answer is? Allowed or not allowed? Yes, your intention is, I'm traveling just to shorten my prayer. I'm going to travel 52 miles in order for me to shorten this prayer. It would be like, I'm going to travel just to break my fast. Not allowed. No, not allowed to do so. The shortening is recommended, right? Completing the prayer like you would normally do as a resident is not disliked. Normally when you think about things that are recommended, if you don't do them, it's disliked. Or you do the opposite, it's disliked. In this case, it's not disliked if you were to pray the prayers fully. So if you are traveling and you do end up praying your prayers as you normally would as a resident, it's not a problem. Again, shortening is recommended. Sadaqah. It's a charity from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are a number of cases which would not allow you to shorten prayer, even if you were traveling. Number one, he says, وَإِن مَرَّ بِوَطَنِهِ أَوْ بَلَدٍ لَهُ بِهِ زَوْجَةٌ. Completion is required, meaning you have to pray the prayer fully for anyone shortening their prayer due to travel who passes by their homeland. You pass by your town. So basically you traveled or you were out and now you're going to another destination. But in order to get to that destination, you got to pass through your town. You're going to pass through your homeland. You don't need anything. You're not stopping at your house. You're not visiting. You're just passing through. Because you've come into your homeland, you're no longer considered a traveler. This is where you reside. And so while you're in there, you cannot shorten the prayer. Or an area in which you have a spouse. For the man that's traveling, your wife. If she's there, that's also like your home. Or an area, a city or a town in which you were married. You were married there. Even if the town is not your residence. Or your wife is no longer there. And this is based on a hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever marries in a region is to pray the prayer of a resident. Of course, until they surpass the constructed homes of the town. All right? He says, أو دخل وقت صلاة عليه حضرا أو أقام فيها. He says, or was a resident when the time of prayer began and then traveled. Meaning the prayer became obligatory as a resident. So our initial example of, I want to travel at 2 o'clock, Dhuhr prayer started at 1 o'clock. I'm going to wait until I travel, and then I'm going to shorten that prayer while I'm traveling. Because the prayer became obligatory for you to pray as a resident, to pray it fully, it must be prayed fully. Even if you have then left and are now underway, you've met the other conditions, and are traveling, you now have to pray that prayer complete as a resident. Or you became a resident while in prayer, such as a person who's on a ship which arrives at home port. In that case, you would have to pray the prayer completely, entirely. You started as a traveler, you're praying, and then all of a sudden, you've arrived. And now you're back home. In that case, once you've arrived, you realize that you're still praying, you have to complete the prayer entirely. Or intended residency while praying. You're praying, and while you're praying, you go, I'm done. Travel's over. I'm going to stay here. Then in that case, of course, you're going to stay the duration that would prohibit shortening the prayer, which we're going to discuss shortly. This would require you to complete the prayer fully. Or, if you intended something which would require completion, like if all of a sudden you change your intention of travel to now be something disliked or impermissible. You're like, oh, I was going to do some business, but you know what? This money, it's burning a hole in my pocket. I think I'm going to go roll the dice. Now your intention's changed to an impermissible one, and now you're no longer permitted to shorten the prayer. He says, "O ذكر صلاة حضر بسفر أو عكسه." He says, if he remembers a prayer of residence while traveling and vice versa, meaning remembers a prayer of travel while in residence. So if, for example, you remembered you missed a prayer that you missed while you were a resident, and then you were traveling when you remembered it. right? So you're on a journey, you're on a trip, you're shortening your other prayers, and you go, oh, you know what? I missed this prayer, I missed the Dhuhr prayer before I left. What do? You have to make it up. How are you going to make it up? You're going to say, well, I'm traveling, so I'm going to pray it shortened. No, we're going to go back to the scenario of it was a prayer that was obligated when you were a resident, and therefore you are going to pray it fully. O aqama fiha, he says, or intended, O aksahu, he says, or vice versa. And that means remembers a prayer of travel while in residence. So now you remember the prayer you missed while you were a traveler. Okay? He said, oh, I missed the Dhuhr prayer while I was traveling. Now I'm back home. But now because you're home, the concession no longer stands because you're not on the journey. And the default for prayer is completion. The baseline rule of prayer is to pray it as it has been initially prescribed, and that is fully and completely, not shortened. All right, so in both cases, you're going to pray completely. He says, أَوْ اتَّمَّ بِمُقِيمٍ أَوْ بِمَنْ يَشُكُّ فِيهِ. This means that if you're led by a resident, meaning that you're a traveler and you're being led in prayer by someone who is a resident. And the resident is going to pray the prayer fully. And you're being led by that imam who's a resident. You're going to follow the imam in prayer. And this was mentioned, of course, explicitly by the great Imam Ahmad. It's based on a statement of Ibn Abbas, saying that this, meaning praying fully behind the imam while a traveler, is the sunnah. You can find this reported by Imam Ahmad as well as in Sahih Muslim. Or someone doubtful, if you're being led by someone doubtful. And that means someone that you don't know is a resident or a traveler. The status of them being a traveler or resident is unknown. Even if you were to say in your mind, if you go, if he shortens, I'm going to shorten. If he prays fully, I'll pray fully. Because you don't know for certain, you can't make an intention as to whether or not you're going to shorten the prayer to follow the imam. So in this case, it defaults to the baseline ruling of praying completely. Now, how would you know if a person is traveling? Either they mention it explicitly, or you know they're traveling, or you can judge based on what they have on. If, for example, they're wearing like the typical clothes of traveler, that might be difficult in our day and age, because most of us wear what we would travel in normally. But in the event, if you're in some parts of the world, you may find that's the case, then you could use that type of an indication to determine whether the person is a traveler or not, and you could go with that. He goes on and he says, أَوْ أَحْرَمَ بِصَلَاةٍ يَلْزَمُهُ إِتْمَامُهَا فَفَسَدَتْ وَأَعَادَهَا. He says, or this is basically a person that makes ihram for a prayer which requires completion, because he began the prayer behind a resident or someone completing the prayer. That's an example of that. He began the prayer, which requires it to be completed, like praying behind a resident or someone completing the prayer, along with its makeup due to invalidation. So if you started the prayer behind the imam who is going to complete the prayer, and then the prayer is invalidated for some reason, like you lose your wudu in prayer, and now you have to leave and go make wudu, and you come back and the prayer is already finished, because you started the prayer completely, you have to make it up completely. It was spoiled while you were making it fully and completely. It has to be made up as it was initially obligated. It says, أَوْ لَمْ يَنْوِ الْقَصْرَ عِنْدَ إِحْرَامِهِ. Or a person who does not intend to shorten at the commencement of prayer. Again, the intention, as you said, the intention is very important here. If you do not make the intention to shorten your prayer at the beginning, in the ihram, which is the takbiratul ihram, then you have to pray the prayer completely, because the baseline ruling is to complete the prayer. If the intention is not made at the time of ihram, the obligation defaults to the baseline ruling again. Or, أَوْ شَكَّ فِي نِيَّتِهِ. He says if they're doubtful of their intention to shorten when making ihram, they're not sure, am I going to shorten it, or am I going to pray it completely? Then again, the baseline ruling is to pray it completely. So in that case, you have to complete the prayer fully. Or he says, أَوْ أَخَرَهَا حَتَّى تَضَايَقَ وَقْتُهَا عَنْهَا. Basically here it means he's delayed it. Meaning you've delayed the prayer without an excuse. to the point that the time becomes constrained. Like you're not going to be able to make the prayer entirely or on time. Like an invalid excuse would be like sleeping over. Okay? So basically here, we're meaning to conclude the prayer in the shortened form in its allotted time. Like the time is too constrained to complete the prayer in its shortened form. Because intentionally delaying the prayer or delaying the prayer due to an invalid excuse, this is something that is sinful in nature. And just like the journey that is sinful in nature, you can't use the concession while sinning. Delaying the prayer without a valid excuse is sinful, and so the concession is not applicable in this case. You intentionally delayed the prayer to this point. Now you cannot use this concession. He says, أو نوى إقامة فوق 20 صلاة لازمه الإتمام, or intends residence. And you can do this unrestrictedly. You end up at a place and you say, look, I'm done, I'm staying. I'm going to stay ila ma sha Allah. I'm going to stay until whenever. I'm intending residence, I'm just going to stay. So that's one way. Or there's a qaid. Like you intend, I'm going to stay for X amount of days or X amount of hours or whatever it may be. If that time is for more than 20 prayers, even if you're out in the wild, right? You're out camping or something like that, you're out in the wild and your intention is to stay for more than 20 prayers. 20 prayers is how many days? 4 days. It's 4 days. Okay, if you have intended 20 prayers or more as a resident, then you have to pray, as a resident, then you have to pray as a resident. Even if it's only 4 days. Let's say, has to be over 4 days, If you intended 20 prayers or less, then you can shorten the prayer. If you've intended more than that, 21 prayers or more, then you have to pray those prayers while you're there as a resident. That means you don't just get to, all right, look, I got 20 prayers to shorten, and then when I get to 21, then I'll start praying them completely. No, the moment that you've intended residency for that period of time, you have to begin praying completely. This period of time is based on the Prophet ﷺ staying in Mecca for 4 days as a haji, as a pilgrim. Right? And this is reported in Musnad Imam Ahmad, Sahih Bukhari, Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ entered Mecca the morning of the 4th of Dhul Hijjah. The morning of the 4th. Okay? And the pilgrim does not leave to make Hajj before the day of Taraweeh, which is the 8th of Dhul Hijjah. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ left the morning of the 8th, which made it 4 days. You might say, wait a minute. Slow down. We have another narration. States we stayed in Mecca, states that we stayed in Mecca for 10 days while shortening our prayer. This is muttafaqun alayh. This hadith is found in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. One of the great Imams, Al-Athram, he said, I heard Abu Abdullah, meaning I heard Imam Ahmad mention the hadith of Anas, in which he said, we stayed in Mecca for 10 days while shortening our prayer. He, Imam Ahmad, said, not everyone understands the words of this hadith because he, Anas, tallied the Prophet's stay in both Mecca and Mina. He added them together. 4 days in Mecca and another 6 days in Mina. If you think about it, right? If you come in the 4th and you stay till the 8th, then you have the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th. And that'll get you to where you need to be with this particular hadith. So that goes to show that this hadith is a combination of 2 durations. The first and most important that we're looking at here is the 4 days that he stayed in Mecca. And another very important thing to consider when traveling is that the day of entry or arrival and the day of exit or disembarking from your temporary place is counted as a part of those 20. Understand what I'm saying? So if you arrive one day at Dhuhr time, you don't go, okay, we're going to start the 20 prayer count tomorrow. This is a day of travel. We've arrived. We're here. Dhuhr time. So we're not going to consider Asr, Maghrib, and Isha of this day as a part of the day. Or Asr and then the day starts at Maghrib time, the next day, however you want to calculate it. No. The moment you arrive, you take a look at the time and you see what prayer is in, if you haven't already prayed it, or what prayer is coming up next that you're going to perform. And then you take into account the number of prayers that you're going to be there for. And again, if it's over 20 prayers, then you'll know what you have to do. Some additional information he mentions, he says, وَإِنْ كَانَ لَهُ طَرِيقَانِ فَسَلَكَ أَبْعَدُهُمَا. Right, here we're talking about shortening here. He says shortening can be done when there are two routes to the destination, one that would meet the distance requirement, and the other which would not. Right, so there's two routes. You're going to a destination. If you take one route, you'll meet that requirement of the distance. You'll meet your X amount of miles. The other route is shorter. You won't make it. You'll be shy of that amount. If you take that longer route, then the concession is applicable. The longest is taken, which means the distance required is shortened. You can do that. Obviously, of course, if the intention is to simply shorten the prayer, then we've talked about that before. But if, so for example, I'm taking the longer route because the shorter route, it's known to be a bad area. I don't want to pass through there. I'm carrying money, I've got some goods, I can't afford to risk maybe getting mugged or jacked or whatever it may be. Or there's a potential rock slide, or there's a potential danger in that route. Even though it's shorter, it's a route that I don't really want to take because there's risk associated with it, so I take the longer route. Right? There's no trickery, there's no double intention, there's no playing around. This is just what it is. And so in that case, it's perfectly fine if you were to take the longer route in order to shorten the prayers. He says, "Oh, ذكر صلاة سفرا بآخر." This is different than what we talked about before. He says, a prayer of travel is remembered during another journey. Not a prayer in residence remembered during a journey, but a prayer of journey remembered in another journey. So you forgot a prayer in one trip. Okay, you remember it all of a sudden, like I'm traveling right now. I remember my last trip, I didn't pray Salat al-Dhuhr. I remember I forgot it. I was in a rush. I was running around. I forgot about it. Now I've all of a sudden remembered. And I'm traveling. How do you handle that makeup prayer? In this case, you're permitted to pray it shortened. The prayer that was missed during a journey is remembered during another journey. In this case, both the nature of its obligation, it became obligatory when you were traveling, and the fact that you are still a traveler. You're considered a traveler now, right? So it's about when it was obligated and your current state, right? So both the concession of travel are present, as well as the fact that you're still traveling now, even though it's a different journey, permits you to make up that forgotten prayer in another journey. If, however, the missed prayer is remembered while in residence, we talked about this, the concession of travel is not present. So you would have to pray it fully, even if you then forgot again. Okay? You came home from your journey, you realized, oh, I missed the Dhuhr prayer on my journey, I have to make it up. I'll get to that shortly. I got a phone call. And then you forget to make it up. And then you travel again, and then you remember it. You say, oh, I forgot to make up that prayer that I missed on my journey, which I remembered when I was home, but then I forgot again, and now I'm traveling. What do you think you do in this case? You understand the scenario? Tim, you have to make it up fully. Because when you remember the prayer, it becomes obligatory. And when you remembered it, you were a resident, and therefore the ruling is, it became obligatory when you were a resident, so you have to pray it fully. The fact that you forgot it doesn't erase the fact that you remembered it while you were a resident. So now you have to pray it fully, even though if you're on a journey, you need to make it. And you have to make it up then when you remember. You already missed it the first time. Now you're obliged, of course, to make it up when you remember the second time. says, أو حبس لنحو مطر ولم ينوي إقامة. Or when one is withheld, okay, he's going to talk about rain, due to rain, etc., but you could also be withheld wrongfully. Somebody could be withholding you, keeping you from traveling. They've taken you captive or something wrongfully, or due to rain, or due to ice or snow, or due to an illness, without the intention to stay. So you end up somewhere, you're traveling, you end up in some destination, and now you can't leave. You're being withheld from leaving. Okay? And you didn't intend to stay. While you're there being withheld, you can continue to shorten your prayer. And this is based on Ibn Umar saying that we stayed in Azerbaijan for 6 months due to snow preventing us from entering, and they continued to shorten their prayer for that duration. 6 months. أو أقام لقضاء حاجة بلا نيتها قصرة. He says here, or when remaining to handle some need without the intention to reside. Right? If you stayed behind, not because you were being withheld, but you stayed behind because there was something that you had to do. So long as that thing that you had to do could potentially be completed within that time frame of 20 prayers, then even if it requires more time and it lingers on, you can perpetually shorten your prayer. So like what you thought you could get done in 3 days takes 5 days, or 6 days, or 7 days, and it keeps getting delayed and it keeps lingering on. You can continue to shorten your prayer. If, however, it cannot be completed within that time frame, even if you don't intend to be there, you're like, I'm not going to intend residency, but I know that I can't get this job done in that 20 prayer period. It's going to take more than that time. Then in that case, you have to pray full prayers. Even if though you haven't intended iqamah, you didn't intend to be there as a resident or to stay there. You're just there for that particular thing. If you know there's no potential for it to be done within the time frame, now you have to pray your prayers fully. And then the moment that you do know how long it's going to take, then you have to proceed based on that time. And the best example today would be your flight gets delayed. Okay, you're at your destination, you're getting ready to return, you've planned it out, you're like, I'm going for less than 20 prayers, no more, and then I'm coming home. You get to the airport, and they say, flights have been canceled. So you go, what are you going to say? What would you say? Your flights have been canceled. What would you do? What would you ask the person at the desk? When's the next flight? So there's one of two things. They can say to you, the next flight is tomorrow afternoon. So now, you hit your 20 prayers, right? You've maxed out your credit card, your shortening card, okay? And they tell you the next available flight is tomorrow at 5 p.m. So now you know exactly how long you're going to be there. And so, there is an intention to stay until 5 p.m. And that means you have to pray the subsequent prayers as a resident. If they say to you, we have no idea, because Federal Aviation has shut down all flights until further notice. They've done that recently, right? All air traffic is shut down until further notice. We have no idea. So now what scenario are you in? You're in a scenario where you don't know. You're being withheld. You don't know you don't know the time frame. So in this case, you're going to perpetually shorten the prayer. So that covers the section on shortening prayers. And as I mentioned, combining prayers together is associated with shortening prayers in many ways. And that's the next section we're looking at, فَصْلٌ فِي الْجَمْعِ بَيْنَ الصَّلَاتَيْنِ, which is basically the section on combining two prayers. Imam al-Bahuti says, يَجُوزُ الْجَمْعُ بَيْنَ الظُّهُرَيْنِ وَبَيْنَ الْعِشَاءَيْنِ فِي وَقْتِ إِحْدَاهُمَا. Here, we're talking about the permissibility of combining between dhuhuraini, that's the two dhuhr prayers, and that's dhuhr and asr, and al-isha'aini, which are the two isha prayers, which is salat al-maghrib and salat al-isha. Right, so it is yajuz, which means permissible, meaning neither disliked or recommended. Shortening is, what's the ruling for shortening? It's mustahab, it's recommended to shorten prayers. Combining prayers is allowed. It's not recommended, unless, of course, there's very, very specific situation. Combining prayer for Arafah or Muzdalifah. And we'll talk about that in the chapter of Hajj. And this is for non-Meccans and those that do not intend to stay in Mecca after they conclude the rites of Hajj for more than 4 days. So, in the case of praying at Arafah and Muzdalifah, it's recommended at that time to combine the prayers. Otherwise, every other prayer, it is permitted, not recommended. And it is permitted بِسَفَرِ قَصْرٍ, due to travel which permits shortening. And we just talked about all of that. So in any of those cases in which you're permitted to shorten your prayer, you are permitted to combine the prayers together. As explicitly mentioned by Imam Ahmad, this is based on a narration of Mu'adh, in which he said that the Prophet ﷺ was engaged in the Battle of Tabuk. If he departed before the sun declined from the zenith, he would delay the noon prayer till he would combine it with Asr and would offer them together. If he departed after the sun had declined, meaning if he departed after Dhuhr prayer was already in, he would combine Dhuhr and Asr prayers and then proceed. If he departed before Maghrib prayer, he would delay it and offer it along with Isha prayer at Isha prayer time. If he departed after Maghrib prayer had started, he would offer both Maghrib and Isha together at the earlier time. This is what the Prophet ﷺ's manner was. Right? It shows here that he would pray prayers together. And this is found in Sunnah Abi Dawood, Tirmidhi, and Imam Ahmad's collection of hadith. So that's number one, is safaru qasrin. Basically, the travel that permits shortening. In those cases, you can also combine your prayers. Also, وَلِمَرِيضٍ يَلْحَقُهُ بِتَرْكِهِ مَشَقَّةً. It's also permitted to combine prayers, Dhuhr with Asr and Maghrib with Isha, for someone ill, which, if they do not combine prayers, it will cause hardship. Okay? Someone ill or someone dealing with a physical condition. Right? So, if it's going to create a hardship, if you don't combine, then you combine. Dhuhr with Asr and Maghrib with Isha. Not combine Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha all in one go, or any other combination thereof, but this is when you would be permitted to combine your prayers. So let's think about a scenario. You're in the hospital, you've gotten banged up, you're in and out of consciousness, it's hard to stay awake, you're on medications, you don't know if you go back down, you'll miss everything. This would be a hardship. You can't control that. So in this scenario, you'll be permitted to combine your prayers. This is based on a hadith of Ibn Abbas, in which he said that the Prophet ﷺ combined prayers without the presence of fear or rain. Without the presence of fear or rain. In another narration, it says, without fear or without travel. Fear, rain, or travel. Both of these narrations are found in Sahih Muslim. And there's no other excuse beyond that except for illness. Some type of physical ailment. So Imam al-Bahuti mentions these two cases, travel which permits shortening, and illness or an ailment which, if the combination is not performed, there will be hardship. That's important to remember. وَبِتَرْكِهِ مَشَقَّةً. If there's no hardship, then no, it's not permissible. But if there's hardship, it's permissible. There are other cases that the Imam doesn't mention that I think are important to mention here. Other cases which permit combining prayer include a wet nurse, due to the difficulty from abundant filth. A wet nurse taking care of a baby. There's abundant filth, perhaps, something happening that it's constantly occurring. And because of the difficulty associated with that, then she's permitted to combine her prayers. Or istihala, which is pseudo-menstruation. This is not the actual monthly cycle, but this is irregular bleeding. And in this case, if the bleeding is irregular and it's causing difficulty, then in this case, it's permitted for her to combine the prayers. Anyone incapable of purifying themselves or making tayammum for every prayer, that's another reason why you would be allowed to join your prayers. If you could not purify yourself for every prayer, not knowing the time, like somebody that's blind that couldn't see the clock or the position of the sun or the shadows, etc. If they don't know the time, then they're permitted to combine the prayer. Or some excuse or work which permits abandoning Friday and congregational prayer. And we've talked about that previously. In this case, you would be permitted to combine your prayer. Okay? And so, I don't think it's far-fetched to run into one or more of these scenarios in your life at some point. And it's important that you know that so you can take advantage of these concessions so that you're not burdened when things get tough. The next scenario has to do specifically with Salat al-Maghrib and Salat al-Isha. He says, وَبَيْنَ الْعِشَاءَيْنِ لِمَطَرٍ يَبُلُّ الثِّيَابِ وَتُوجَدُ مَعَهُ مَشَقَّةٌ وَلِوَحَلٍ وَرِيحٍ شَدِيدَةٍ بَارِدَةٍ وَلَوْ صَلَّى بِبَيْتِهِ. Or a combination, this is specifically for Salat al-Maghrib and Isha, not Salat al-Dhuhr and Asr. Even, he says, if prayed at home, whether you pray at the masjid or you pray at home, the prayers can be combined due to rain. Assalamu alaikum. We'll see you next day. Due to rain which soaks the clothes and is coupled with difficulty. Remember the two here. Rain which soaks the clothes. That means not a drizzle, not a sprinkle, not a smells like rain, or I feel rain in my bones coming. Not a, oh, look at those clouds. That's a rain cloud there. Let's combine prayers for that rain cloud there. But rain that's heavy enough to soak the clothes and it causes difficulty. If there's no difficulty associated with it, then you haven't met the conditions in this case. Right? Soaks the clothes and is coupled with difficulty. And this specific scenario, a person may say, well, why not for Dhuhr and Asr? Why is it just for Salat al-Maghrib and Salat al-Isha? Because this is the only thing reported from the Prophet ﷺ, that he did this for these two prayers and not the others. It's the only thing reported regarding rain. Combining Maghrib and Isha prayer is also permitted with the presence of mud, as he says here. وَلِوَحَلٍ وَرِيحٍ شَدِيدَةٍ بَارِدَةٍ وَلَوْ صَلَّى بِبَيْتِهِ, he says, or strong, cold wind. So if it's permitted for strong, cold wind or for mud, then obviously heavy rain is that much more difficult. Okay, so, sure. Like snow or ice or something of that nature. Again, he says, even if you pray at home. So, the case that one prays at home, whether you're at home or at the masjid here, if there is a covered walkway from your house to the masjid, there's a covered walkway, or there's a tunnel going under, you're not going to get wet. The concession is applied in a general way. It's a broad stroke. It's applicable to everyone, and it doesn't deal in specific scenarios. So the concession is not to be taken. Your specific scenario is not considered in the concession. But what's considered is the general public. The general public has to be considered. Okay, so therefore, if you're at home, or you can get to the masjid with a tunnel or underneath a covered pathway, the concession still applies. So long as the requirements are met, it is permitted just as the concession for travel. Right? Because travel, it could be difficult, it could be easy. Remember we said we can get hundreds of miles in an hour. We're sitting in the first class seat, we're asleep. We're getting served food and we're eating and we're better than we normally eat. But we're still permitted because the concession is applied in a general way. It says, وَالْأَفْضَلُ فِعْلُ الْأَرْفَقِ بِهِ مِنْ تَأْخِيرٍ وَتَقْدِيمٍ. It says, whichever is easiest regarding delaying. So this is now the question of when do I combine the prayers? I'm going to pray Dhuhr and Asr. I'm going to pray Maghrib and Isha together. When do I do that? Do I do it at Dhuhr time or do I wait for Asr time? Do I do it at Maghrib time or do I wait for Isha time? So the best, the most virtuous thing is to pray according to what is easiest. It's very well known. The Prophet ﷺ, if he had to choose between two things, he would choose the easier of the two. So if, for whatever reason, taqdeem, which means to advance the prayers, is easier for you, then you advance. If ta'khir, which is to delay, is easier for you, then you delay. If they're equal, فَإِنِ اسْتَوَيَا فَتَأْخِيرٌ أَفْضَلٌ. If it doesn't matter, this one or that one, one's not easier than the other, then you're going to wait and delay. Why do you think that's the best? Okay, he says because the time is not in for the other prayer. So Dhuhr and Asr, when do you pray? At Dhuhr time or Asr prayer? You say, okay, what's the easiest thing? Well, it doesn't matter to me. They're the same. He says you have to wait until Asr time to pray Dhuhr and Asr because the time hasn't come in for Asr prayer. But aren't we allowed to combine the prayers? Isn't this a concession? Yes, it's a concession. We're not talking about what's permissible or impermissible. We're talking about what's preferred. And it's preferred because, number one, the time, as was mentioned, has not entered for Asr prayer. So you're praying a prayer outside of its time. And what is typically obligatory is you pray the prayer when the time enters. If you pray the prayer before the time enters, the prayer it's not valid. You pray, then someone says, okay, here's a scenario. Muhammad, did you pray? Yeah, I already prayed, Dhuhr. Well, that's funny because the time hasn't come in yet. Oh, okay. So what do we do now? Too bad. You have to pray again. You have to pray again. Right? Because the time's not in. Yeah, so with this concession, though you're allowed to pray the prayer outside of its time to advance the prayer, what's preferred is that you pray the prayer, both of them, when the time has entered. So if you wait until Asr time, Dhuhr prayer has already entered, and now Asr time has entered. So technically you're praying both prayers after their time is entered. Also, this is khuruj min al-ikhtilaf. As they say, is to avoid any differing opinions. Right? We would consider the other opinions when coming to this conclusion. This particular afdaliyya, which is better, is not the case regarding the prayers at Arafah and Muzdalifah. Okay, they have, one is taqdeem and one is ta'khir. And we talk about that in the chapter of Hajj. So those rulings are fixed. However, every other prayer, this is the way you determine which one you pray at what time. So regardless the case of delaying or advancing, for the combination to be valid, to combine, both sets are to be prayed in sequence. So you can't pray Asr before Dhuhr prayer. Isha prayer can't be prayed before Maghrib prayer. If that were to occur, it wouldn't be valid. Right? So that's one of the conditions of validity. It says, وَإِنْ جَمَّعَ تَقْدِيمًا اشْتُرِطَ نِيَّةُ الْجَمْعِ عِنْدَ إِحْرَامِ أُولَى. So now we're talking about some more conditions of validity. It says, if the combination is advanced, for it to be valid, there are 4 prerequisites that must be met, 4 conditions of validity. The first is a prerequisite that there be an intention to combine before the ihram of the first of the combined prayers. So if you're going to combine Dhuhr and Asr prayer, you have to intend that before you begin Salat al-Dhuhr. Your intention is, I'm going to pray Salat al-Dhuhr and combine it with Salat al-Asr. If you don't make that intention, it's not permissible to combine. Before this ihram of the first is the correct time of intention. Just like the intention that's made for congregational prayer. Part of your intention to pray congregational prayer is, I'm praying in congregation. I'm praying as a congregant. That's made at the beginning, or as an imam. If you're going to be the imam, you intend to be the imam. I'm going to lead a congregation in prayer. Right, so the intention, so that they're performed attached together, one after the other. And if the essence of that is not achieved or is not achievable, meaning they've been separated by any more time than what was mentioned, iqama or wudu khafif, then the combination is invalidated. It will be invalidated by a sunnah ratiba. Okay? So you're not going to pray another prayer in between those two prayers. You've intended to combine them. Now you're not going to break them with another prayer. If you want to pray a sunnah ratiba, then you can do that after the combination of prayers in order to make that up. If you wanted to talk, as long as the conversation or whatever you were going to say was short enough that it would fall within that time frame of iqama or wudu khafif, then it would not invalidate the combination, even if what you're saying was not like dhikr or dua. You had to quickly give instruction, or you had to quickly say something. Hey, let's go get something to eat after we do this. And then you jump into the combined prayer. It's fine. It's not going to invalidate the combination so long as that period of time is not exceeded. The next thing he says, وَوُجُودُ الْعُذْرِ عِنْدَ افتتاحهما وَالسَّلَامِ أُولَى وَاسْتِمْرَارِهِ إِلَى فَرَاغِ الثَّانِيَةِ. So that's the last two prerequisites. He says, in the presence of the excuse which permits combining at the beginning of both the first and second prayer. So the reason that you're allowed to combine your prayer has to still be in existence, has to still be present at the beginning of both the first and second prayer and the first salam. So the opening of the first prayer is the time of an intention, and the salam of the first and the opening of the second is the time of combination. So that it can be valid because you are praying it on time. But if it ends during the second prayer, while you're praying Asr, and now you become a resident, you're still praying Asr, the Asr prayer would be invalid. Because now you're a resident, the concession is gone, and now you're praying Asr before it's fixed time. Understand? Understand the way the scenario works? Okay? And so what would you do with that Asr prayer? You would now change it to a nafila. You would complete it as a voluntary prayer. And illness is the same way. If you were ill and you were praying a combination of prayers and then all of a sudden you felt better and the illness subsided and now you were feeling good enough to where that concession is no longer applicable to you, then you would proceed in the same way. You need to think about these excuses and concessions as a cover. All right? This is you praying the obligatory prayer as it normally would be prayed, on time and completely. And then you have a concession that comes along and covers that, applying different rulings. Shorten and combine. All right? Once that is removed, what's left? You and the prayers that are normally prescribed. All right? So that's gone, and therefore you have to proceed as you normally would. So that is how it works with rain or with illness or whatever excuse. Or travel. The last part of this, he says, وَإِن جَمَعَ تَأْخِيرًا اشْتُرِطَ نِيَّةُ الْجَمْعِ فِي وَقْتِ أُولَى قَبْلَ ضِيقِهِ عَنْ فِعْلِهَا وَاسْتِمْرَارُ عُذْرٍ إِلَى دُخُولِ وَقْتِ الثَّانِيَةِ. Says if the combination is delayed. Now we're talking about waiting to pray Dhuhr with Asr at Asr time. So obviously we're going to pray those together in sequence, Dhuhr and Asr. There are two other prerequisites for that combination to be valid. The first is that the prerequisite to have the intention for the first time with the presence of the excuse, meaning that during the Dhuhr time, you're going to intend to pray Dhuhr at Asr time. Dhuhr time enters, you have to have an active intention that I'm going to pray Dhuhr with Asr at Asr time. That's number one. And that intention has to be made before it becomes too constrained to perform it. Again, the time, you don't wait until the very last minute to make that intention. Otherwise, there's no point for the combination, right? Because now it's Asr time. And the whole reason for that was to create ease and to relieve you from a burden, to join the prayer, combine the prayer. So if you've waited that long, then you've missed the point. You've missed that whole time while Dhuhr was in, you could have prayed it, where now you could have felt relieved, but you didn't do that. Take advantage of the combination, and so now the combination has been invalidated. The second prerequisite here is the presence of the excuse from the beginning of the first prayer until the time of the second prayer. That which permits combining prayer as an excuse, right? Whatever your illness or travel or whatever it may be, this is an excuse. And so, if it doesn't continue to the next prayer, the concession is void. Again, like an ill person who becomes better or a traveler who becomes a resident. So in this case, if you're a traveler, this is perhaps the most obvious example. If you're a traveler and you've intended to pray Dhuhr at Asr time, and then you arrive home early, there's an hour left until Asr prayer. Well, I intended while I was traveling to pray Dhuhr with Asr at Asr time. But now I'm home and there's an hour until Asr prayer. What would you do? He said pray Dhuhr. When? You're home now. So your travel is gone. That intention doesn't matter anymore because the concession is no longer applicable because it doesn't exist anymore. You're not a traveler. And so therefore, when you arrive, 1 hour, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 5 minutes early, enough time to where you could perform the prayer. Guess what's obligatory? Dhuhr prayer. Has to be prayed. And then when Asr prayer enters, then you pray your Asr prayer. That's how it works. So that excuse has to be present until the time of the second. Otherwise, the combination is invalid. All right, quickly the last section here is Faslun fi Salat al-Khawf, which is the fear prayer. Imam Buhuti says, Salatul Khawfi tajuzu kama warada anhu sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Basically, the fear prayer, this has been reported in the Quran and the Sunnah as well as it's deemed permitted by way of consensus of the companions. It's permissible during permissible combat. Right? So military service, legitimate permissible military service and combat, even if you are a resident, even if you're in your hometown and you're engaged in permissible combat, you're allowed to perform the fear prayer as been narrated from the Prophet ﷺ. And there are 5 or 6. Some have reported 6 or 7 ways to perform the fear prayer. So one of those ways has been reported in Sahih Bukhari Muslim. And this is concerning those who witnessed the fear prayer that was performed in the battle of Dhat al-Riqa' while they were in the company of the Prophet ﷺ. So the way they performed the prayer was that one group would line up behind the Prophet ﷺ while another group would face the enemy and continue fighting. The Prophet led the first group that was with him in 1 rak'ah. And he stayed in the standing position while that group completed their second rak'ah. They completed that by themselves, and then when they finished, they went away. And they began to fight with the enemy, and those that were fighting while they were praying were relieved to now go pray. And they joined the Prophet ﷺ while he was in the second rak'ah. And they followed him until he finished and he sat for the tashahhud and he stayed seated, not completing the prayer. They stood up, they completed until they joined him in the seated position, and then the Prophet ﷺ concluded the congregation with the taslim. And that's how they prayed the fear prayer. Imam Ahmad was asked about the other variations of this fear prayer. And he said that whoever chooses any of the mentioned methods has done well. However, I choose the method reported in this transmission. So in the fear prayer, what is it that you're permitted to do? Right? So here's a scenario where they were just able to pray freely, even though the prayer was changed for them based on the scenario. If you are in a situation like this, and we're using the example of fighting because that's typically why it's discussed and when it was happening, the fighting becomes intense, so much so that you can't sit still and you can't just perform it as you normally would, but you are on foot sometimes, or you can be mounted on your vehicle or whatever. You can pray the fear prayer facing the Qibla, or not if you can't because of the combat. And in this case, you might not be able to make ruku or make sujood because you can't take your eye off the enemy. And you would be gesturing in prayer to the best of your ability while doing so. And he says, وَيَحْمِلُ نَدْبًا فِيهَا مَا يَدْفَعُ بِهِ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ وَلَا يُثْقِلُهُ kasayfin. Right? So it's recommended to carry something for defense, which is not too heavy, like a sword or a knife, or if it's a firearm. If it's a firearm. وَلَا يُبْطِلُهَا كَرٌ وَفَرٌ لِحَاجَةٍ وَلَا حَمْلُ نَجِسٍ يَحْتَاجُهُ. And it's not invalidated to strike and to move, even if that is an abundant amount of movement and striking. Like, so you're in the middle of fighting. Most of us would say, that's never happened. That was likely not to happen. What military service are we going to be involved in, etc., etc.? While it is a real thing, I think the biggest lesson for us here tonight, is how important the prayer is. The nature of it being obligated. Right? Even during combat, you're still obliged to pray. Forget about, I'm at the shopping mall and I don't want to quit shopping right now. Or I'm out, I'm playing a game and I don't want to interrupt the game, or I don't want to stop and have to do this whole thing, and I got to find a place, and now I got to make wudu, and the game is on, or the thing, or what. We're talking about you're in combat, you're wielding a weapon to defend your life, and you're praying. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, whatever it is that you're doing. If that's the status of the prayer, then I'm not sure we could find a suitable excuse to not pray. And then he ends here, he says, nor by carrying najis if needed. Of course, in that scenario, najis would be like blood. Right? In this scenario of combat, there might be blood. You might be bloodied. You might have been injured and your clothes are drenched in blood. Typically, you would have to remove that, right, because of the impure nature of it. But in this case, if it's needed to have that on, it's needed to have that, the weapon maybe has blood on it, I don't know, then it permits the prayer. It's not invalidated because of that najasa. And that is where we will wrap up for this evening. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu alaihi wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad.